Hey everyone, my name is Camille van Horne, and I'm excited to walk you through a webinar focused on how to influence in times of uncertainty with the backdrop of what's been going on at Instacart over the last few months. To give you a sense of agenda, we're going to cover a brief introduction of me and what brought me to product. Then we're going to define influence and what it means in the context of this presentation. We're then going to take a step back and look at the landscape that Instacart was facing at the time of the early shelter-in-place announcements and the method that we applied in order to essentially cut through the noise and identify the right solutions to shore up our operation. And then we'll basically round out the conversation with key takeaways. So to give you a sense of my background, I was born in New York to French-American parents, and that's definitely where I developed my taste for French cheese, as well as my questionable taste for leopard print leggings. And from there, I ended up going to Chicago to attend the University of Chicago and ended up sticking around after school and joined Sears, the big box retailer, under the hedge fund that owned it to focus on online digital products to help turn around the company. I led the online personal shopping program as a director of product and was able to grow it from scratch to a $60 million business. To be completely honest, I ended up falling into product a little bit by chance, but what really drew me to it was that it essentially was a role that was a GM role for the digital age, in which you would see product end to end and work cross-functionally and evangelize the work that was happening within the org. After about 4 years at Sears, I ended up going to Stanford to pursue my MBA, and that's where I really firmed up my interest in product management. I took classes across the engineering, design, and business school, and ended up landing at Instacart, where I'm now the group product manager overseeing the shopping and delivery flows. A few things that aren't on my resume are that I'm the youngest person to break the sound barrier, and I did this by flying the Concorde with my mom when I was only 2 months old when she was on a business trip to Paris. And in non-COVID times, I spend a lot of time in museums and galleries. And this was more the case before business school, but one of my biggest fears in life is public speaking, so we'll see how today goes. As I was thinking about this presentation, I wanted to go back to first principles. And I think that in general, there are a lot of misconceived notions of what influence means. And so I wanted to spend some time simply defining what influence is. And so the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. And so what you don't see here is that it has nothing to do with being the center of the decision-making process, and it has nothing to do with being the loudest in the room. The way I choose to interpret this definition is that essentially it's having a hand in moving a positive direction in a project. And that's how we'll talk about it today. So this is a very exciting graph for investors. For people who are close to any operation, it's really terrifying. And this is essentially the weekly delivery time series for Instacart leading into COVID, and then once shelter in place was announced. We saw 500% growth year over year in delivery volume. And naturally, the bad news is that having this type of growth that was completely unplanned for overwhelmed our operational processes and systems. A real email I received from my partner's sister is actually pasted here, and I'll walk you through some of the finer points. So she reaches out and asks whether I can help, as her husband's parents, who are over 80 and immunocompromised, had planned to receive their Instacart delivery that day. And on the day that they were supposed to receive the delivery, Instacart had sent them an email telling them they would only be able to deliver the following week. This was naturally a very personal email to receive and horrible. And I think that, it's a very tangible demonstration of a lot of the frustration that our customers were having with our service. at a time in which we were becoming an essential service. And to give you a sense of some of the problems we were facing, so we had very few delivery slots. Our support centers were flooded with incoming calls, and we were seeing order cancellations, meaning orders that had been placed and then subsequently canceled due to out of stocks or too few shoppers on our platform. I'm now going to walk you through the way in which we essentially developed a framework to influence in this time of uncertainty when so many different parts of our business needed support from product. And the first place to start is naturally identifying the problem. And when you're in a case of really rapid growth, a lot of various stakeholders will have different claims as to what the biggest problem might be. Taking the time to identify the most important problems for the business is, I would say, the first step in making sure that you can carve through the noise and go after the highest impact projects. The second step to take is to stack rank the drivers of the problem. So once you know the problem that you're solving, in our case, we were focused on order cancellations. The key there, once you've identified the problem, is to look at the drivers of cancellations. So are we seeing a driver being out of stocks? Are we seeing a driver being the fact that we may not have shoppers to accept the order? Those are two, I think, salient examples that ended up being some of the places where we spent a lot of time. Once you have stack ranked the drivers through a framework that we'll get into, then you want to focus on finding a set of solutions. And once you do find those solutions, you need to execute and measure on this. So let's apply the framework. Naturally, the key upfront is to identify the problem, as we said. And I think what can be really challenging early on when you have this type of disruptive growth is that everything feels urgent, but you don't really know what's important. And so going to this 2x2 matrix, essentially what you'll see here is importance and urgency plotted out. And at the moment, when you come out of the growth, you're literally in this general area. So everything feels urgent, but it's not clear if it will be important to fix what feels urgent or not. And what I would recommend doing here is really taking a step back and identifying what is most important to your business at a given time. Is it growth? Is it retention? Is it quality? And finding ways to align the problems to the most important company goals is what I would recommend of a product manager at this point in time. And I think just in terms of key lessons in leadership, when you're dealing with disruption, it's very, very common to panic or to be negative. But what I would recommend as an alternative, and this doesn't come as second nature, I think, to anyone, is to run towards the problem to help out in the most constructive way possible. And the second thing I would recommend is to show support to team members who may be directly in the fire and be dealing with a situation that may be perceived as a failure. Once you've identified the problem, I recommend stack ranking the drivers. So what you see here is a table focused on the order journey, cut by cancellation initiator. And so in our case, what you'll see is that we essentially added volume numbers of cancellations that had been, or orders that had been canceled, And we looked at it across all of the states that we see in our product. So brand new is before the shopper accepts the order. Picking is when the shopper has accepted the order and is currently picking. And then delivering is when the shopper is delivering the goods to the customer. And then we looked at essentially those who had actually initiated the cancellation, whether it was the customer or the shopper or admin care. And we did this across not just volume of cancellations, but also cost, so that we can understand the biggest pain points to our system. And while we came up with the framework collectively, the data scientist on the team actually was the person who compiled all the data and ended up presenting out the findings. And I think, this is a good reminder that sometimes as a leader and as an influencer, The key is to take a step back and to let others lead. And there's no downside to seeking advice from the experts. So now that we've basically identified the problem, stack ranked our drivers, we know what is important and urgent. So in our case, we're going to narrow down our focus to basically making sure that we have available shoppers for orders that we accept and that we reduce out of stocks. When you're in this point of certainty, or at least focus, it's really important to communicate. So order cancellations was a very little known area in our product prior to COVID because we had never had any types of spikes in cancellation rate. And so as a byproduct of that, we needed to develop a common vocabulary to share with leadership and with the broader organization around the work that we were doing to reduce cancellations. And we coupled this with milestones, dates, and owners to make sure that everyone understood who was responsible for what and by what timeline they would expect to see change. Naturally, in this type of environment, emotions are heightened. And what I would always recommend is that if you need to have a hard conversation, have it in person or over the phone, given that we're in COVID times, and never delay that communication. And so, all of these conversations were had, and we were able to get buy-in across the organization. And from there, we were able to ship 30 experiments, process improvements, and bug fixes to shore up our cancellation experience. And what I would say is that some of the highlights included increasing our basket minimum for customers. And the reason we did this is because we discovered that out of stocks were largely driven by smaller orders. And so raising the basket minimum made it such that we were just seeing far fewer order cancellations. We also reduced the number of deliveries that we would accept after noon to ensure that we could find a shopper to fulfill the order. We also looked at our error handling to make sure that if something did go wrong, we delivered the best experience to those customers. And so we basically split up a whole work stream focused on rescheduling orders to next day. You may remember the message that I received from my partner's sister, and she was basically saying that it was terrible that her partner's family was only going to receive their order the following week. We actually took that example to heart and essentially made it such that when we reschedule, we're always rescheduling to next day. And then in addition to that, we wanted to make sure that customers always knew the status of their order. And so we worked through a whole experience focused on clear and timely messaging to reflect the state of the customer's order, so they never had to be worried about where their order was at any point in time of their journey. One of the final points I'll make is that what was really critical was connecting all of this work to customer outcomes. Customer outcomes are critical because it generally helps people feel like they're part of a broader purpose and mission. And this is a tweet that particularly resonated with me, where we were dealing with a customer who has asthma, was pregnant, and frankly couldn't leave the house given the conditions. And she used Instacart and found this to be a total lifesaver so that she could maintain a quality of life for herself and her child. And so this was, I think, a great example of ways in which we, helped our customers in very difficult times. And so I would recommend, as product managers, to always tie the work that you're doing to the broader customer impact. So to connect, what we discussed to generally some key takeaways, I think the ones that I want to leave with you is the emphasis on support. So in times that can be perceived as failure, it can be very compelling to take a step back or walk away. And in reality, in those moments, that's when the team members undergoing the problem need the most support. The second area that I want to talk through or want to make sure that you take away is that sometimes leadership is about taking a step back and letting others lead. Naturally, as I'm sure you all are very well attuned to, Insight is critical in making decisions, and making sure that you're constantly framing problems in terms of data makes processes like these way easier to have a command over. And then I'm going to tie the back two together. Communication is critical. So setting up frameworks, having a common vocabulary, and being intentional in that communication is key. And if you are able to tie it to emotions, particularly customer outcomes that are positive, that will go the longest way when appealing to whatever stakeholder you're speaking to within an organization. And I think ultimately, all of this work was in service of ensuring the safety of our customers and ties directly to Instacart's mission, which is to create a world where everyone has access to the food they love and more time to enjoy it together.